This episode contains discussions of racism, starvation, cannibalism, violence, and death, in some cases involving children. If this isn't something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. I also recommend listening to Part 1 before moving on to Part 2, as some previous details will factor in some of the decisions made in Part 2. There will also be a Part 3, as I can't cover the whole story in just 2 parts. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. In Part 1 of this episode, we covered the westward journey of the Donner/Reed party, who were traveling in 1846 by wagon train from Springfield, Illinois, toward Sacramento, California, which at the time was a Mexican province. The emigrants, as they were called, joined up with another caravan, but separated in western Wyoming because they wanted to take a shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff. This route, which was actually untested, took them through the Wasatch Mountains, where they had to blaze their own trail through the mountainous woods. They then crossed the Great Salt Lake Desert, where most of their cattle, horses, and oxen died of dehydration or ran off. After this, they made their way through a treeless, swampy area toward the Humboldt River, where they finally joined back up with the proven California Trail. Soon, they entered the eastern foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was now the end of October. Much of the party had made it to Truckee Meadows, including Patrick and Peggy Breen and their 7 children, William and Eleanor Eddy and their 2 children, Franklin and Elizabeth Graves and their 6 children, plus 1 grown and married daughter and her husband, Sarah and Jay Fosdick, Louis and Philippine Kesseberg and their 2 children, Amanda McCutcheon and her daughter, Lavina Murphy and her 5 children, as well as her grown daughter Harriet Pike and her 2 children, and Margaret Reed and her 4 children. Several teamsters, single adult men hired to help drive the cattle and oxen, were also with them, including Charles Berger, Patrick Dolan, Milt Elliott, Joseph Reinhardt, James Smith, Noah James, Augustus Spitzer, young Antonio, and Eliza and Bayless Williams. The Donner family, which included George and Tamsin Donner and their 5 children, Jacob and Betsy Donner and their 7 children, and their hired men John Denton, Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, Samuel Shoemaker, and Hiram Miller, were around 7 miles or 11 kilometers back east along the Truckee River. The recently widowed Doris Wolfinger was also with them. A small contingent of the party had gone ahead to find help and supplies at Sutter's Fort on the other side of the mountains. This group was made up of Charles Stanton, a teamster, and William McCutcheon. Another group had also gone ahead to find help, made up of James Reed, who had been exiled from the party for killing a teamster named John Snyder, and Walter Heron, another teamster. The weather was growing steadily colder, and the threat of snow hung heavy in the clouds. The Donner party now had a choice: attempt to make it over the Sierra Mountains before the snow began to fall, or buckle down for the winter. The Breens, the Eddies, and the Kessebergs had the healthiest animals and wanted to press on. The Murphys, Graves, and Reeds were considering a day of rest before moving on. And the Donners, their teamsters, and the widow Wolfinger were so far behind that they were likely to stay the winter, despite their efforts to press on. It was eventually decided that the party would rest a day or so and then head to the mountain pass just west of Truckee Lake. The Sierra crossing was supposed to be the hardest part of the journey, and the travelers wanted to prepare as much as possible. They made repairs to their wagons, tended their remaining livestock, and hunted what game they could. Meanwhile, Reed and Herron had crossed the mountains and were close to starvation as they moved slowly toward Sutter's Fort, 90 miles or 145 kilometers away from the struggling Donner Party. The two men were close to eating their horses when they came upon a familiar face in Bear Valley. Stanton had just come from Sutter's Fort with 7 mules laden with supplies, as well as 2 Native Americans of the Miwok tribe, who had been named Luis and Salvador by their slave master, John Sutter, owner of Sutter's Fort. It should be noted that at this time, racism and white supremacy were the norm among Americans. Other races and ethnicities were often treated as others, ignored, or taken as slaves by white settlers. It's for this reason that we have so little information about Luis and Salvador and any other indigenous peoples the Donner Party came into contact with, and why the indigenous peoples of the area attacked or avoided the Donner Party. Stanton informed Reed and Herron that William McCutcheon had become ill and was recovering back at the fort. Stanton gave Reed and Herron some of the provisions he carried and then kept on his way back east toward the Donner Party. Unaware of the supplies headed their way, the forward contingent of the Donner Party began to move again, following the Truckee River toward Truckee Lake and the mountain pass that would get them over the Sierras. Temperatures were falling, and the clouds looked heavy with snow. Patrick Dolan whooped when he recognized Stanton coming towards their wagons with his supplies. Stanton was deemed a hero as he passed out flour, beef jerky, sugar, beans, and tea. He then rode on to do the same for the Donners, who were still a ways behind. After passing out all he had, he returned to the Reeds in the forward contingent. Resupplied, the party continued on their way. While camping just north of Crystal Peak, they were attacked by a party of indigenous raiders who shot 19 of their cattle, injuring them. George Donner's wagon axle snapped, and the rear contingent had to stop and repair it. During these repairs, an axe came down on George Donner's hand, cutting him badly. Eventually, the wheel was repaired, and they pressed on, but this injury would have severe consequences later. It was raining in the valley, but the party could see that the rain had become snow in the mountains. It was early in the year for snow, but the emigrants were also a month behind schedule. Little did they know that the winter would also end very late that year, making it one of the longest and most severe winters on record for the area. It was nearly November by the time the forward contingent made it to Truckee Lake, a glacier-fed lake at the eastern foot of the Sierras. Almost vertical walls of granite bordered its northern and southern side, the only outlet being a small pass on the northwestern edge called the Fremont Pass. Pines covered the rocky ground, and there was little game to be seen, as most animals had already moved to lower ground with the chill weather. On October 30th, a snowstorm hit just as the forward contingent reached Truckee Lake. The next day, they struggled onward through the snow. They passed an abandoned cabin on the eastern side of the lake. It had been built 2 years earlier in 1844 by the first emigrants to take wagons over the Sierras, opening the Truckee route to Sacramento. The next day, another snowstorm, more severe than the first, pelted the travelers. The Breen family backtracked to the abandoned cabin and took shelter there. However, the roof was collapsing, so they stayed nearby in their wagons. The Breens planned to try again for the pass in the morning, but when they awoke, they found 3 feet or 1 meter of snow on the ground. Still, they yoked their weakening oxen and made it 2 miles toward the pass before having to backtrack to the cabin once more. Feeling defeated, they began to repair it, worried they would truly be stuck at the lake for winter. They also killed some of their cattle, stashing the meat in the snow and using the hides to repair the roof. Stanton, the Murphys, Eddies, Graves, and Kessebergs thought they could make it over the mountains before another snowfall. They planned to leave the wagons and use the oxen and cattle as pack animals and the mules to carve out a trail. They would travel by foot, even Louis Keseberg, who had accidentally pierced his foot by stepping on a sharp willow branch. Confusion over what to take and what to leave behind stalled their plan to leave at dawn. Many families still had goods they would need in California, like bolts of fabric, dinnerware, and clothing. Several people knew it was ludicrous to try and take these things, but their logic did not prevail. Either way, the oxen didn't want to take the loads placed on them, so it was slow going to get them to move. The group approached the pass around noon, but by then the snow was waist deep and the trail was buried. Charles Stanton and one of the Miwok men went ahead to scout. They reached the summit and saw that it would be difficult to attempt the pass, but it could be done. When they returned, they found the exhausted emigrants digging out places to sleep for the night around a tree they had set alight as a fire. Stanton tried to rally them, but no one wanted to risk the pass. The sky was already darkening with snow clouds. Indeed, it snowed all night. By morning, there were drifts of snow up to 10 feet or 3 meters deep. The pass was now totally blocked. Defeated, the group backtracked to their wagons and then to the cabin where the Breens were holed up. Meanwhile, the Donners were still struggling to catch up. They wanted to be somewhat close to the rest of the party for safety in numbers. Eventually, they came to a small meadow at the junction of Alder Creek and Prosser Creek, 6 to 7 miles or 10 to 11 kilometers northeast of Truckee Lake. There wasn't any snow there just yet. George and Jacob Donner and some of the teamsters set about building a cabin, but they were all so weak from starvation that they had to stop building when the walls were only 4 logs high. That's when the snow began to fall on them. They quickly assembled lean-tos of pine boughs with raincoats and blankets for roofs. A tent was also quickly erected, and the families and their teamsters all huddled inside these 2 structures. It snowed for 8 days straight. All the travelers could do was tend to their fires, gather wood, and maintain steps in the snow so they weren't completely buried. The cattle and mules were missing, likely buried in the snow. Some were shot to eat while they could still be found. All parts were saved to eat or use to repair their shelters. The locations of the carcasses were also marked so that the emigrants could go back and get whatever the snow preserved. The Kesebergs, Spitzer, and Berger set up a lean-to shelter on the west side of the Breen cabin. Dolan and young Antonio were welcomed in with the Breens. Around 200 yards or 183 meters south of the Breen cabin, the Eddies, Fosters, Pikes, and Murphys erected a small cabin against the side of a large boulder using pine logs. The Graves built a large 2-room cabin about half a mile or 1 kilometer downstream of the other cabins. It was a sheltered spot closer to the trees. Each room in the cabin had a fireplace and its own door. The Graves and McCutcheons moved into one room, and the Reeds and their teamsters moved into the other. Stanton, Luis, and Salvador also moved in with the Reeds. It's not known why they set up so far from the others, but the division of the cabin was done to give each family its own space. There were now 80 people camped out in Truckee Lake Valley in 2 separate camps. Over half of them were under 18 years old. There were 59 people around the lake and 22 at Alder Creek. They were sheltered, but provisions were still running low. Some families still had cattle, while others didn't. And as before, many families were resolved to look after only their own. Morale was not good. Meanwhile, on October 28th, James Reed and Walter Heron finally made it to Sutter's Fort. They reunited with William McCutcheon, who was feeling much better. Also at the fort were Owl Russell, Edwin Bryant, and William Boggs, members of a wagon caravan the Donner/Reed party had joined earlier in the journey. They told Reed that the United States had gone to war with Mexico and that President Polk was looking for volunteers to fight at the Los Angeles garrison. Hoping he might gain military aid for a rescue effort, Reed volunteered, with the caveat that he be allowed to take provisions back to his family and the rest of the Donner Party before active duty. John Sutter was happy to equip Reed and McCutcheon, who volunteered to go back with him. With a cash collateral from Reed, Sutter gave the men 30 horses, a mule, a hind quarter of beef, and a large supply of beans and flour. They were also given 2 more Miwok slaves, called vaqueros, to help drive the animals through the snow, which had yet to fall on this side of the mountains. They left Sutter's Fort in the first days of November, riding through 4 days of rain. When they reached the head of the Bear River in the western foothills of the Sierras, they found 18 inches or 46 centimeters of snow. On November 5th, the rain in the valley became snow and grew to around 2 feet or 60 centimeters deep at the foot of Emigrant's Gap, the spot where the trail through the Sierras came down into the valley. Near the gap they found a small camp. A man named John Curtis and his wife were stranded in their wagon. Reed gave them some of the supplies and promised to guide them back to Sutter's Fort on his return journey. Reed and McCutcheon continued up into the mountains, struggling through the snow. They soon lost the trail in the Sea of White. They were between 10 and 12 miles, or 16 to 19 kilometers from the summit, but the trail was impassable. The snow was just too deep. Frustrated and more worried than before, Reed and McCutcheon created a cache of the supplies on the mountainside and turned back toward Sutter's Fort, taking the Curtises with them as they went. Back at Truckee Lake, the emigrants had begun the process of trading and butchering the cattle and oxen that were left. The meat was stored in the snow, quickly freezing in the cold. The blood and organs were consumed quickly, usually as stew. The bones were cracked open to get at the nutritious marrow that lay within, and the hides were cleaned and placed on the shelters to reinforce them. Every day, William Eddy borrowed a rifle and went hunting, but game was sparse. He was able to bring down an owl and a fox at one point, and gave half to William Foster, who lent him the gun. Finally, on November 12th, the snow stopped. Charles Stanton, Franklin Graves, and 11 others made an attempt to get to the pass and ascend the mountains, but the snow was 10 feet or 3 meters deep by that point, making the journey impossible. Thankfully, the next day, Eddy was able to bring down a grizzly bear and her cub. Franklin Graves helped him drag the carcass back to camp, and the two shared out the meat to the other people camped around the lake. On November 20th, Patrick Breen began a diary. This is the only first-hand account of the events at the lake camp that winter. It was written on 8 sheets of paper folded into a 32-page booklet. The entries are short and to the point, and don't contain much emotion, but do summarize exactly what was happening. It's from this diary that we can glean most of what occurred. However, there is no such written source for the Donner Camp at Alder Creek. Breen included information about it whenever someone made the trek there and back, but for the most part, we don't have much information about the Alder Creek Camp's daily activities. It wasn't until recently that archaeologists actually located the campsite. More on that in Part 3. As the snow began to melt, another group began to prepare for an escape and rescue expedition. 22 people, most from the lake camp, including 6 women and the 2 Miwok vaqueros, felt the risk would be worth it. They set off with the 7 mules and a few supplies on November 21st. They made good time and actually made it through the pass to the western side of the Sierras. However, infighting over whether to leave the struggling mules behind caused the group to eventually turn back. On the 24th, more snow dumped on the lake camp, and the leaders of this escape group, Stanton, Graves, and Eddy, decided it was unsafe to try again. They were wise not to go. It didn't stop snowing again until early December. Wood became scarce, and the animals that were left quickly died and were buried under the snow. When people finally emerged from their cabins, they took apart their wagons to burn as firewood. When that ran out, they used small pieces of their cabins to start fires on whatever green or wet wood they could find. Augustus Spitzer was so weak he could barely sit up. The Breens took pity on him and moved him from the crowded Kesseberg lean-to into their cabin. Margaret Reed spent much of her energy passing out small rations to her children and helping Eliza Williams tend to her brother Bayless, who was also very weak. The healthier folk began building snowshoes for another expedition attempt on the next clear day. At the Alder Creek camp, Tamsin Donner was caring for her husband, whose whole arm was now showing signs of infection. Jacob Donner was on his deathbed, as were Samuel Shoemaker, Joseph Reinhardt, and James Smith. They were all too weak to do anything, so the Donner women continued to gather firewood and shore up the shelters as best they could. The food situation at Alder Creek was dire. They boiled the bones of their animals to a gelatinous broth, as well as cooking the now moldy hides that had been serving as their roof. They also caught and ate field mice that tried to shelter in their tents, as well as pine needles and twigs. Bayless Williams was the first to die on December 15th. His body was buried in the snow not far from the Reed Graves cabin. Jacob Donner was the first to die at Alder Creek Camp soon after. He was also buried in the snow. Shoemaker, Reinhardt, and Smith followed shortly after. On his deathbed, Reinhardt confessed to the murder of Mr. Wolfinger. He and Spitzer had shot him, probably hoping to return someday and loot the buried Wolfinger wagon. Milt Elliott and Noah James came from the lake camp to help bury the men and to show Jean-Baptiste Trudeau how to probe the snow with hooked sticks to search for buried cattle. They also brought a letter from William Eddy requesting a compass for the next expedition. Another heavy dumping of snow kept both Elliott and James at the camp for a few days. When it finally let up, Elliott went back to the lake camp, hoping to join the expedition, but James stayed at Alder Creek to help the Donners. However, Elliott didn't make it back to the lake camp in time to join the expedition, who didn't wait for him to return with the compass. We'll find out whether or not this was a mistake after a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 45,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 140 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, have access to all the horror story readings, and get updates on past episodes. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly quiz episode where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the resources I've used while researching an episode. And for $20, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, we have reviewed horror video games and television shows, discussed the plague pits of London, and tried out historic recipes from previous episodes. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now back to the podcast. In 1881, 34 years after the terrible winter of 1847, Author Charles F. McGlashan had had enough of the lurid and embellished stories of the Donner Party. Therefore, he published a more factual account of their ordeal with the help of several of the survivors. In that book, entitled The History of the Donner Party, A Tragedy of the Sierras, McGlashan named the expedition that set out on snowshoes on December 16, 1846, the Forlorn Hope. The name is unfortunately fitting, as you'll soon hear. The group was made up of 17 members of the Donner Party, 10 men, 5 women, and 2 children. Led by Franklin Graves and Charles Stanton, the group included Graves' 2 daughters, Mary Graves and Sarah Fosdick, Sarah's husband, Jay, Amanda McCutcheon, who was the wife of William McCutcheon, Harriet Pike, Sarah and William Foster, William Eddy, Pat Dolan, Charles Berger, young Antonio, Luis, and Salvador. Lemuel Murphy, age 13, and William Murphy, age 10, also accompanied them. 4 men and 3 women were parents who all left their children in the hands of wives or trusted neighbors. The members dressed as warmly as they could and brought along an axe, a rifle, 2 pistols, gunpowder, and as much tobacco as could be spared to help with stress and hunger pains. They also brought 6 days of meager rations and 13 pairs of snowshoes. Unfortunately, this left the Murphy boys and Charles Berger without. They quickly fell behind as the expedition set out. William Foster ended up taking William Murphy and Charles Berger back to the lake camp, but Lemuel Murphy promised he would keep up. The group made it to the northwest head of the lake by nightfall. William Foster caught up, and the group made a small pair of snowshoes for Lemuel. The next day, they made it 6 miles, or 9.5 kilometers, camping just west of the summit. Most of the expedition had frostbite on their hands and feet by then, but they set out again at first light. The sun was so bright that many suffered from snow blindness, which occurs when UV rays from the sun are reflected off the snow and into the eyes, a condition akin to sunburn on the cornea, causing blurred vision, pain and swelling, and a feeling like sand is trapped in the eye. Stanton was the worst affected by this. Luis and Salvador led the way until nightfall when the group made camp. Stanton was the last one to reach camp. The snow was 11 feet or 3.3 meters deep, and that night it began to snow again. The group began to doubt their decision to leave. Some of them suffered hallucinations, and the food rations were almost gone already. Still, they trudged on. On December 21st, when the food was completely gone, William Eddy discovered a package in his pack from his wife. It contained a small amount of preserved grizzly bear meat. Eddy kept this to himself and tried to make it last as long as possible. That morning, as the expedition prepared to leave camp, Mary Graves noticed Stanton sitting on a log near the fire, smoking his pipe. He appeared to be staring numbly into the meager flames. She called to him, and he replied that he'd catch up. The group moved on without him. After more than a week of slogging through the snow, the expedition had no idea where they were. They continued to hope Stanton would catch up, unsure if he was alive or dead. They built large signal fires atop prominent hills, hoping he'd find them, but he never did. Days of freezing drudgery passed. The bodies and minds of the expedition members were deteriorating quickly due to starvation and cold. They tried to treat their frostbite by rubbing snow on it, which we know today would have only made things worse. On Christmas Eve, having gone for 3 days without food, all but William Eddy, Luis, and Salvador said they could go no further. Some wanted to turn back, but the women of the group pointed out that they'd never make it back. It's very likely that everyone was suffering from hypothermia and starvation, a combination which can cause weakness, dizziness, muscle pain, insomnia, hallucinations, and heart murmurs. They knew their end was near, but still tried to plan for survival. Someone, possibly Patrick Dolan, finally suggested the unthinkable. They must eat a member of the group to survive. Shocked and horrified, the group resolved that the first person to die naturally would be eaten, but they refused to kill one of their own for food. Young Antonio died the next night after falling unconscious into the campfire. Soon after, a massive snowstorm hit. The fire began to sink into the deep snow and wouldn't stay lit. The group made a makeshift tent by sitting in a circle and stretching blankets over themselves. It was warm inside, but they were still hungry. Franklin Graves died at 11 p.m. that night, urging them to eat him before he fell unconscious. Patrick Dolan had a fit and tore off his clothes and boots in what we now call paradoxical undressing, which occurs in the later stages of hypothermia. He died soon after. After 36 hours in their makeshift tent, the group emerged as the icy wind and snow died down. They set fire to a dead pine tree when they were unable to start one on the ground. Then they set about doing what they hoped they'd never do, butchering one of their own, Patrick Dolan, and roasting his flesh over the flames. No one could look at one another as they ate, and many wept as they did. Eddie, Luis, and Salvador refused to eat it. Sarah and Harriet tried to get Lemuel to eat, but he refused. He began acting strangely, catching a mouse and eating it live. He thrashed and bit at anyone who tried to subdue him. Eventually, he died as well. 5 men and 5 women were left alive. They ended up consuming all of Patrick Dolan, Antonio, Franklin Graves, and Lemuel Murphy. No one ate the flesh of anyone they were related to. They also smoked much of the meat. This would make it last a while and could be carried with them. On December 30th, the members of the Forlorn Hope expedition left the spot they had named the Camp of Death. As horrific as it had been, those 4 men had saved their lives. Though they were now fed, the expedition still had frostbite to deal with. Their feet and hands were swollen and cracking. They were only able to move a few miles away from the Camp of Death that day. That night, Eddie, still starving after refusing to eat the flesh of his companions, broke down and ate some of the dried meat. The next day, the group was able to go about 6 miles, or 9.5 kilometers, but left a trail of blood behind them from their frostbitten feet, which had begun to burst due to inflammation. That night, they set alight another dead pine tree as their campfire and consumed the last of the dried human flesh. With their food source gone, they turned next to eating hide shoelaces and shoe leather, wrapping their feet in blankets instead. One of Luis's toes fell off as he walked due to frostbite. Jay Fosdick had slowed down. William Foster had grown delirious and impatient. He proposed they kill the 2 Miwoks for food. William Eddy reminded him that Luis and Salvador were their guides and could lead them to safety, but the rest of the group were with Foster. Eddy quickly warned Luis of their plans, and both Luis and Salvador disappeared in the night. The next day, Eddy went with Mary Graves to hunt. They spotted the bloody footprints of the Miwoks, but also saw a deer. Eddy shot it, but didn't bring it down. They followed it until it finally died. Then they built a large fire and shot the rifle in the air to call the others to their location. However, the rest of the group had already made camp and refused to budge. Jay and Sarah Fosdick were trailing behind the rest. That night, Jay died. William Foster found Sarah in the morning and brought her back to camp for venison, which Eddy and Mary Graves had also brought to camp that morning. The Fosters then went back to find Jay Fosdick's corpse and butchered it, despite Sarah's pleas that they leave it be. It was roasted over the fire alongside the deer. Of the 7 members left, the women were in the best physical shape. Foster suggested to Eddy that they should kill one of them for food. His behavior had become more and more erratic as they traveled. That plan was dropped, however, when the bloody footprints of Luis and Salvador were spotted again. The group found the 2 men dying in the snow. Despite protests from Eddy, Foster shot them both, and the rest helped butcher and cook them. Eddy refused to eat their flesh. This was the only confirmed occasion when anyone in the Donner Party killed another person in order to consume their flesh. The rest of the expedition members began to distance themselves from William Foster. They worried he would try to kill them in their sleep, but thanks to a long-hoped-for stroke of luck, they didn't have to worry for long. 2 days after the murder of Luis and Salvador, the group found a trail that led them to a Miwok village. At first, the villagers thought the expedition members were ghosts due to their emaciated figures and bloodied feet, but eventually they took them in and cared for them. The compassion shown by the indigenous peoples of the area is often left out of the Donner Party story and will be discussed further in Part 3. The expedition members were passed from village to village until January 17th, when Eddie, who was recovering the fastest, was taken to Johnson's Ranch, 15 miles or 24 kilometers away from the closest Miwok village. The Miwoks left him there, where he was taken in by Matthew Dill Ritchie and his family. Word spread quickly among the other inhabitants of the ranch. The news of the missing Donner Party had already made it to the ranch, and they were surprised to see anyone from that group had survived. The men of the ranch collected blankets, food, and medicine and brought it to the Miwok village. They thanked them for caring for the starving settlers and brought the rest of the expedition members back to Johnson's Ranch. The Forlorn Hope expedition had been in the icy wilds for 33 days. 8 men had died and been consumed in order for the rest to survive. But survive they did, and now the outside world knew of the snowbound and starving people they had left behind. As I mentioned in Part 1, if you want more information than I was able to relate in this episode, I recommend Michael Wallace's book, The Best Land Under Heaven. I also suggest reading McGlashan's book, The History of the Donner Party, A Tragedy of the Sierras, as well as Ethan Rarick's 2008 book, Desperate Passage, The Donner Party's Perilous Journey West. In Part 3, we'll discuss the long and arduous process of rescuing the trapped emigrants from the Sierras, as well as the aftermath of their ordeal. Until next time, keep up that spark of curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media. And please, please, please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Sam, Sarah, Gemma, Lauren, Christy, Stacy, and Pam. Sarah A., Paul H., Michelle B., HD Pars, Karen H., James S., Josh, and Kelly P. all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you so very much. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.